joining us tonight. My name is Shannon Rush. I'm the Associate Artist at State Theatre Company of South Australia, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. And I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, the Kaurna people, and to pay respects to elders past, present and future, and that respect extends to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here tonight. So this is very, very exciting. Our next show at State Theatre Company is the incredible The Dictionary of Lost Words. Now, this novel, written by the exceptional Pip Williams, has taken the world by absolute storm. And our very wise artistic director, Mitchell Butel, has approached Pip, of course, asking whether or not she would be open to us doing a stage production of the show. And of course, she said yes. And so we're thrilled because we get in first, which is excellent. We couldn't be happier about it. Mitchell then, of course, approached the incomparable Verity Laughton to write the script adaptation for us for the stage. And we're currently in week 3 of rehearsals. I'm lucky enough to be working on the show as the Assistant Director. And let me tell you, it's going to be brilliant. It is an epic story, it's going to be an epic stage show, and audiences are going to be absolutely delighted with it. Tonight I'm joined by both Pip and Verity, which is excellent. We're going to have a bit of a chat about the show and the adaptation, and so we'll get to that very soon. But first of all, I would like to introduce Isabel Story, who is going to come up here from the library today and just talk to us a little bit about the collection here in the library and how it relates to the themes and the topics of the novel itself. So over to you, Isabel. Thank you.
So hello everybody. I'm going to take you on a very brief tour of just a few items in the State Library collections which relate to tonight's tangent talk. And of course I'm starting with Pip's books. If I can get this to move, I'm starting with Pip's books. Let me try this. That's better. Okay. So the Dictionary of Lost Words covers a lot of territory as Pip takes us through Esme's life from early childhood into adulthood, and we see a welter of experiences and emotions over her next decades. We also learned a lot about how a book is made, from conception to printing and publishing, and one of the key characters is a printer. Now, Garrick worked on a much more advanced machine than this. This is part of the first printing press in South Australia, the Stanhope printing press. And this photograph shows part of it, which was brought to South Australia from England by Robert Thomas in 1836 on board the Africaine. It was used to print the first number of the Register newspaper, which was published in Adelaide on June 3rd, 1837, and also 100 copies of the 1836 Proclamation of South Australia. So after her husband has gone to war, Esme picks up a copy of a book of poems that he's left face downwards. The poem is The Dead by Rupert Brooke. Brooke himself died young from an infection from a bite on his way to Gallipoli, and there were 2 versions of the poem with the same name, but usually this is the one that's referred to. And I'm just going to leave it up there for about 30 seconds for you to look at. And you can see a 1915 edition of Brooke's poems in the display case in the foyer. You can find a lot of interesting items in the State Library collections. I did a search for Verity Lawton, and I came up with 17 hits. Now that is only a fraction of what Verity's written, I think. We don't hold them all. But this one is very relevant to the State Library. Verity, I'm sure you remember this. You used some of the World War I letters, I believe, found in the South Australian Red Cross Information Bureau, and you constructed this theatre piece in 2016. You can search the letters yourself from the Information Bureau. If you just go to the State Library homepage, go to Collections, then South Australia, and scroll down and you will find the SA Red Cross Information Bureau. I know that Pip did a fair bit of her research here, but I don't know, Pip, if you're familiar with these books by British lexicographer Lydia. Yep, you're nodding. In Mugglestones.
It's the best surname ever.
Absolutely. She is a really, really good writer. Non-fiction. There are many more that look at the OED and other dictionaries and how they were made by many different authors. Dictionaries seem to fascinate researchers and now fiction writers as well, which is terrific. We're all about books, so we're on the same page. Now, I do know that you used the original published items of the Oxford in your research, and I know that because Susie told me how she dragged them down from the top floor. They're very narrow stairs. She would have taken the lift, actually, in the trolley. So we hold the original versions thanks to Sir Josiah Simon, and this, what I'm showing you at the moment, is part of his original library at Manoa, which was his residence and estate at Upper Sturt. Now, after his death, the library was bequeathed the Simon Library in its entirety to the public library, which is now the State Library, and it's now housed on the 3rd floor of the Mortlock wing. This is what, that's another view of it. This is what the more recent volumes look like, all 20 of them, housed in the Spence wing, and these are the originals. And the gaps are for the ones that are on display in the foyer. Now also, most of you would know that a Shakespearean play features quite early on in the book. It's Much Ado About Nothing. I'm sorry, I'm still on the OEDs. They are big books, aren't they? Not quite that big. So yes, a Shakespearean play features quite early on. And this is one of the versions of Much Ado About Nothing held in the Simon Library. So Josiah had a great interest in all things, not just the law. He was, of course, a very great legal mind. But he had an interest particularly in all things Shakespearean, including criticism and controversy over the real authorship of the plays. Here's just one of his many shelves. That's just Shakespeare. That's a small part of the room. Here's another set of the collected plays. Now these are nearly as heavy as the OED volumes, but less conveniently located at floor level. I don't know why they do that, but there they were. Esme spends a lot of time collecting the lost words, and the argot, the slang, and the not very nice words. And these days it's easy to find collections of the slang and the not so nice words, but it's, of course, not always up to date because language is constantly changing. When I did a search on Oxford Dictionary, I came up with, I think, 457 hits, and that was just variations on all kinds of different dictionaries, not just to do with the language. You would have done the same, I think, yes. Okay. Right. So I'm just going to finish off with a couple of slides. This mahogany wood panel was one of two that was gifted to the State Library during the sesquicentenary in 1986. The man who created them was Douglas A. Dunstan, who was also, as it happens, director of the Griffin Press, which brings us back full circle. This mahogany panel was titled The Evolution of the Book. He made it himself. He took up wood carving as a hobby. And it's absolutely amazing. It is so detailed. It shows the beginning of cave painting and early writing through the Egyptians, through to Gutenberg and his press, and then the mechanisation and computerisation of printing. And I'm just going to show you this little detail. Bottom left, he's done a much more modern press. You can just, I think, see the figure sitting at the press somewhere there on the left. I don't think I'm ever going to look at the panel again without thinking about Esme and Gareth and the lives of so many people that are so beautifully depicted in the book, and now the play of The Dictionary of Lost Words by Verity. So, thank you.
So, The Dictionary of Lost Words is the penultimate show for our 2023 season, and it's a co-production with our friends at Sydney Theatre Company. It premieres here in Adelaide from the 22nd of September, and then it will transfer over to Sydney and play from the 16th of October. Director Jessica Arthur, whose work you'll have seen in Shortface recently, is at the helm of this mighty production, and honestly it is a true privilege to watch her work and bring this story to the stage. And so I'm going to assume that most people in this room have read the novel. I think that would be the case. We will apologise in advance if there's any spoiler alerts if anyone hasn't read it, but I imagine most people will have it. Just in case, a really brief overview. The Dictionary of Lost Words follows the story of a motherless girl, Esme, who grows up in the scriptorium under the table where her father and Sir James Murray's team of lexicographers are compiling the Oxford English Dictionary. The story spans over 100 years and it is set during the women's suffrage movement and also the First World War. Over time, Esme discovers that the words in common use, particularly those used by women, are not included in the dictionary. So she embarks on a journey to start collecting these words that otherwise may never have been written down. So let's welcome to the stage our wonderful guests here tonight, Pip Williams and Verity Laughton. Thank you. So let's introduce these wonderful people, although they don't need that much introduction really. Pip was born in London, grew up in Sydney, and now lives in the Adelaide Hills with her family and an assortment of animals, apparently, which is great. She spent most of her working life as a social researcher, studying what keeps us well and helps us to thrive. And she is the author of One Italian Summer, a memoir of her family's travels in search of the good life, which was published by a firm press to wide acclaim, of course. The Dictionary of Lost Words is her first novel, if you can believe that. You know, not bad for a first, really. Based on her original research into the Oxford English Dictionary archives. And it was published in 2020, so during a pandemic, pretty much.
2 days after we went into lockdown.
2 days after lockdown, okay. It became an international bestseller, of course, and its much anticipated companion novel, The Bookbinder of Jericho, became an instant #1 as well when it was released earlier this year. So Pip, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're very pleased to have you here. And the wonderful Verity Lawton is an Australian playwright and poet. Her 30-plus produced works have been seen in Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, the UK, the USA, all over the world. And they include main stage adult dramas, adaptations, plays for children and families, radio plays, even a musical in there as well.
Definitely a musical.
And Verity has been nominated for and won a list of awards and prizes as long as your arm, including things like the Griffin Prize, the Inscription Prize, 2 Orgies, the New South Wales Premier's Award, the STC Patrick White Award. I could go on and on.
Those were nominations.
Yeah. And recent works include Long Tan and the Red Cross letters, as you saw before as well. And current works include a film, South Australian Film Corporation funded development of a film called Flatlands with director Matthew Thorne, a publication of a book of poetry, and also a song cycle based on the reimagining of Shakespeare's The Tempest. So to say that you're a very well-qualified person to adapt this novel is a bit of an understatement. Verity, thank you very much for joining us tonight. All right, so Pip, let's start with you. You probably get asked this question all the time, but how did this story come to you? How did this begin?
Has anyone read Simon Winchester's The Surgeon of Crowthorne? Yes. There we go. So I read that book quite a few years ago, and when I came to the end of that book, which was fascinating, by the way, I highly recommend it, it's non-fiction and it's all about the relationship between James Murray and William Chester Minor, who was one of the people who sent in those slips with sentences and words and how they were used in text. And it's a really interesting story, but by the end of it, what I had absorbed was an understanding of how a dictionary, that dictionary, had been put together. And my social science brain immediately went to the question, hang on a minute, this must be a biased text because all of the words that are in the dictionary had to have been written down. And this was a project that started in the mid-1850s, when most of the words that had been written down by men. And not all men, but men with an education and from the upper classes. And so my social science brain just thought the data is skewed towards men's experience. And I asked the question, do words mean different things to men and women? And if they do, does it matter that the dictionary has been made by men using words that have been written down by men? And that's where the book started. I couldn't actually answer that question very well. The only work that I could come across that could help me answer that question just from a curiosity point of view was Linda Mugglestone's work. And has anyone read Linda Mugglestone's work? No. And that's the problem sometimes with history and non-fiction, is that we don't access ideas and questions because we don't access those books. And so I thought I would explore it through fiction by putting a little girl under the sorting table where all those words were being defined and seeing how they affected her as she grew into a woman.
Excellent. It's extraordinary the way that you weave the two together, the fiction and the non-fiction. That must be quite a task. And also the story is across 103 years, so 1886 to 1989.
Though most of it finishes
most of it finishes there, but we get a little bit in 1989. It's huge, really. There's so much research that needs to be done to make sure that it's factually correct and the data is all correct. And then you weave that into the fiction as well. So what is that like as a process? What does the research look like for that? It must have been absolutely epic.
It was epic, but I love research. So that was my job for 25 years. I was a research academic, and I really enjoy it, and I know how to do it as well, because the worst thing about research is it can go on and on and on. And so one of the skills of research is knowing how to put parameters around it, and that was a really useful skill. But I just love learning. I love finding out. I love pursuing my curiosity, and that's what I was doing writing this book. And the other thing that was really important to me, though, was to stay true to the history that I knew to be true. So I'm talking about dates, when things happened, people, that sort of thing, because we know that history can be as subjective as a fiction novel, but there are some things that aren't subjective, and that's when the war started and which battles were when and when the words were published. And so everything that I know to be true is true in the novel. And the reason that was important to me was because I don't read history books very much either, and I get a lot of what I know about the world comes from fiction, and I like to know when the fiction has played with the history and when it hasn't. I don't mind that it plays with the history, I just like to know when it has. And so that was just something that was important to me as a novelist, and maybe because of my research background, I would have been pilloried if I had made up anything as an academic, and so I think I just had that as a leftover.
Yeah, and it's just beautiful how you weave the fiction into that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very good. And Verity, you have been entrusted to adapt this novel into the first ever stage play. Oh my goodness, no pressure.
No, I agree. Yeah, quite scary, but it's a lot of fun.
It's wonderful. So what attracted you most to the project? What attracted you first?
Look, I think it was the voice of that little girl, it's a great big book. So it was a great big interesting technical task to do that, and that can be very enjoyable. Just the jigsaw puzzle side of nailing something. And when I start things, I always have huge confidence that I can do them. And then I find out halfway through that, I've got tickets on myself and I can't. so there was that side. It was a lovely challenge, and it was nice to be asked. And I had just read the book just quite recently, so it felt, that lovely bit of synchronicity when a project finds you, and it feels a little bit meant to be. But the other thing was the voice of that little girl, the way that she was secretive, the way that she felt invisible, the way that she kind of found her way to her intention in her own way, which was very kind of not devious exactly, but quite strategic. And she gave herself permission in the quietest of ways to find solutions to her problems. I just loved it because I think that is a lot of women's experience. It spoke to me because I've been something like that little girl. The challenge of bringing her to life in three-dimensional form was very attractive to me.
Absolutely. And tell us about the process then for you from the moment of receiving the commission to now being every day almost every day in the rehearsal room with us as we work on the play. What does that process look like for you?
Obsession, basically. I get very obsessed about my projects, as do we all, of course, but I become very single-minded. I remember the phone call with Mitchell. I was just driving past the Coromandel Valley Bakery, and he rang up, and mostly in cars these days, your phone works. So he rang up, and I thought, oh, better stop. So I took the call, and that was the beginning. And of course, I was pretty thrilled. Like Pip, I love learning things. I really enjoy the process of research. I'm not as brilliant a researcher, I'm sure, as Pip is, but I'm pretty dogged. So once I had the commission in place, I did a lot of research. And then, because I wanted to leave myself time to get the first draft wrong and then still write another first draft by the deadline, I sort of went at it hammer and tongs. So I wrote what I kept calling a sketch draft while I tried to nail the structure of the piece. And that was very strange, with lots of diagrams here and there and lots of writing in Pip's beautiful book in pencil and folding down of pages, which I know is anathema to plenty of people.
I completely condone that.
Oh, thank you. The way in for me was very much a playwright's way in that this has since been rubbished by the designer, but who is wonderful, Jonathan. But the way in for me was to imagine it all on stage, happening on stage, and to write in how that happened. So I had a prologue, which we've since dispensed with. At the end of the prologue, the trunk, which was on the stage, then converted into the scriptorium. And that was how I got my start, really, with the idea of stage magic, which kind of went on through that sketch draft. But when I got to the end of the sketch draft, it felt like it had a shape. So I then wrote an official first draft. And when we had a reading of that some months later, my main concern at the reading was to see if the chronology would hold, and it did. So after that, whenever I was taught writing, I say to my students, all writing is just rewriting, and that's basically true. From then on, it was just rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. As I learned more about the characters, and I got a better sense of how it would feel in three-dimensional form.
Lovely. You mentioned structure.
Yeah.
And I thought it might be interesting to hear you both talk about the structure and how that differs between the novel and then the play? Because I know we've had some interesting conversations about structure as well, Verity. So yeah, it might just be good to flesh that out a little bit.
Well, actually, it's really interesting. Verity and I were having a chat just earlier. So Verity just talked about how she had this prologue at the beginning, which helped her to get into the story, which was to have the trunk there, which then turns into the scriptorium. My first draft of the novel was incredibly similar. So the beginning of the novel in the first draft actually started at the point where the word bondmaid has been discovered missing. And Esme runs to the trunk in Lizzie's room, opens it and empties it out. And essentially what she's doing is emptying out her memories. And then we go to the beginning. And I had written it in this sort of slightly circular way where the trunk became really important. 3 times throughout that original draft, the trunk is opened and then we go back sort of 10 and 15 years and we go through the story. And what was so interesting is that we both sort of used this as a starting structure independently of each other. And we were talking about it earlier, and I think what that does is it sort of gives us an idea of where the story and the character is heading, because we start with her in her future, if you like. And it for me, it dictated that this was in a kind of, it was in past tense, but it wasn't being recalled from the distant future. It was being recalled from a kind of near future. So she didn't know her future, but she did know some of her past, if that makes sense. And it helped, I think, for me to get a sense of the tone and the voice. And I think from what you were saying, a similar thing happened. And then once you've written the novel or you've written the play and it becomes clearer and clearer, you can dispense in a way sometimes with that original structure because it's not necessary anymore, because every scene is aware of its future to some extent. I just found that fascinating that we got into the story in a very similar way.
Yeah, absolutely. From your perspective then, Verity, in terms of how that shifts when you are writing a play.
Yeah.
And the structure changes that you've found.
Well, one thing that we were talking about when we were having our little chat. One thing we were talking about when we were having our chat before was Pip said that once she got her structure, it actually stayed, and she didn't shift chronologies much at all. I don't always find that. It's necessary to be quite ruthless on stage. If something works, it works. If it doesn't, the audience is going to tell you. So after a while, you develop the capacity for making really quite hard decisions about scenes or monologues. I love a good monologue, but you're not really allowed.
You're just not allowed too many.
You
can have a few, but not too many.
I wrote my first adult play was a one-person play that was apparently larger than King Lear. Poor actor. She womanfully did the whole thing. She was brilliant. But I will tend to be quite tough with sections of the play. They either work or they don't work, and I'll move them around quite a lot if necessary. So in the case of this play, basically the shape of it has stayed the same, but the prologue is gone. That helpful prologue has gone, because I was very aware at we've had 3 workshop/readings, which is unprecedented and incredibly generous, because when you work as a playwright, you only really get it when you can hear it. So right from the very first reading, I understood that the early scenes went on too long. There were things in every scene that I felt were essential, to set the story and the backstory and all the rest. But I was very aware it needed to be shortened. So when I was kind of pushed a bit to get rid of the prologue, actually it was a good decision. And I'm very comfortable with that now. We've spent a lot of time, also there's an epilogue, sneak preview, there's an epilogue.
I did mention spoilers before, so.
And we have spent probably longer, that is a bit of a monologue, probably longer on that than almost anything else in the play, because it's got to land right. And when you all leave the auditorium, it's got to be a little bit in your head and in your heart. So that's important to get it right. Did I answer your question?
Beautifully.
What's really interesting though is you said before this is a novel that spans nearly 100 years, and more than 400 pages.
Yeah.
And I am just constantly amazed and in awe that Verity has been able to distill the DNA of this story so beautifully into 2 hours plus.
It's about 2 hours now.
And when I actually came to I think the first read-through, a very early read-through, and it made me cry. And it wasn't because I was seeing something I'd done being translated into some other art form. It's because I was moved by the story, quite independently of having written it. And I knew how it ended. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was like, you know...
You knew what was coming,
I knew,
but it still
was like
got you.
seeing, you know, 4 weddings and a funeral for the 5th time and still crying because the story just, even though you know, because the story just picks you up. But it was the way Verity did it, which was different to the way I wrote it, and so effective in that particular medium, because it is a different medium, and that's we've talked about this. I am absolutely thrilled to hand over something I've done and relinquish control, because I know that the stage can give this story something that I never could. And I'm so excited to see what that is.
Yeah, great. It is very special, and it is such a huge story. I mean, we were saying 400 pages, and you weren't necessarily limited to 400 pages. That's just how many it took for you to tell the story. But to some extent, there is a restriction on the stage show, because we're not creating a 6-hour epic here. We do want to kind of get it into about the 2.5 hours with interval is what we're aiming for, and to distill that amount of story and all the events and all the detail of the characters, such a massive undertaking. And Verity, honestly, I think you've done an exceptional job, and we're still continuing to work on that even during the rehearsal process, and we'll come to that a little bit in a moment as well. But I'm interested to know how collaboratively or not you have worked together while the stage play is being written. You know, you just mentioned, Pip, it was nice to be able to hand it over and relinquish control. Have you had much to do with it since then?
No,
or not a lot at all?
Not very much. We caught up for coffee early on, and we talked about the book, and it was so clear right away that you understood everything I had been trying to do in that story, so that I didn't have a moment's anxiety. And I think that's why it was so easy for me to go, great, here's my baby. You take it, you do whatever you want with it. And I think other than just, Verity has been very generous in letting me read a couple of drafts of the script, and anything that I knew, again, it's the researcher in me, anything I knew to be an incorrect fact, I would essentially give feedback. And one or two other very minor things, but honestly, I'm not a playwright, and I think it's a mistake for anybody to think that a writer of one kind of thing can actually write something else. I don't understand the business of being a playwright, and I wouldn't assume that I could really give Verity any productive feedback. And so my feedback was always around accuracy, character traits, that sort of thing, but very little otherwise.
basically, Pip's sort of underselling herself a tad there, because she is kind of marvellous on those details, and I have asked her, just specific questions from time to time, because she's got the answers at her fingertips. But I guess it's just, what is your writerly self? I'm somebody who probably thrives most on atmosphere, on tone, on dialogue, on character. I feel quite confident in those areas, but any adding up in any play that I ever write, you have to check, like my collaborators have to check. I will get some numbers wrong. Sad, but true.
And the occasional Esperanto word.
Absolutely. A typo.
Which actually happens in novel writing too. I mean,
I suppose
you
so,
make a
yeah.
mistake in chapter 1 and that mistake is still going to be there in chapter 40.
Yeah. So details like that, just being able to sort of speak to Pip from time to time, has been really lovely and a privilege. But mostly she's been a generous and trusting ally, and it just helps. Yeah.
There's layers of handing over, isn't there? We've got the novel gets handed over to the playwright, now gets handed over to the director and the production team and the creatives, and then they take their vision and create the next thing. So it's lovely to see. Fantastic. And so Verity, you've been in rehearsals with us most days, and we're still working on, little script tweaks and things like that here and there. And Pip, I believe we're welcoming you into the rehearsal room a little bit tomorrow morning. Yeah. Is that right? To come and hang out with us and watch some of the work that we've been doing. What has it been like for you, Verity, in the rehearsal room as a playwright? How have you found that experience?
It's always a fine line being the playwright in the rehearsal room, because, as we were all saying, it is a process of gradually handing it over. There's got to be a stage when the cast and the crew and director and all own it for themselves, not trying to deliver something that I or the theoretical playwright have made, but to make something that belongs to them, that is invested with them. So it's kind of a fine line between being there enough to catch things as they fall, or to defend something that you think, actually I don't want to lose that bit, and being open to somebody's beautiful realisation that a tweak here is going to make a real difference. I like to get something, a script, as done as humanly possible. I have experienced that thing of making changes on preview night, but that was only once, and it was necessary. But I hate the thought of it. So it's really getting those changes done and responding to, like an actor delivers a line, and they will, when they're still learning the lines, they will have a really instinctive grasp of the grammar of it. And sometimes they'll change, for example, a pronoun, and you hear it and you think, oh, got that right, Or an actor will find a line hard to deliver, and you think, and then you realise that yes, it would be good to amend that. Or somebody discovers a half-baked fact. Yes, please, let's amend that. And often there's a fine-tuning of the longer pieces of dialogue, because we are trying to save time. We are trying to make it all happen within the 2 hours. So quite often there'll be shavings of sentences or shavings of words. And after a while, you just develop a facility to respond to that. Hopefully you know the moment to step back and allow your peers their head, because they know what they're doing, like they are the ones who are used to staging something as opposed to adoring a word or being in love with a character or something like that. They're the ones who actually get it up there. So you bow to their expertise. Yes.
I was just thinking, it's as a novelist, I've often said that the novel, even once it's published, is only 75% done, and actually the reader finishes it off, because every single reader will have read the Dictionary of Lost Words slightly differently, depending on their own experience. So just one quick example is that a lot of women come up to me and they think that the main theme is motherhood. I didn't for a second think that motherhood was a theme, although I acknowledge that I wrote a lot about motherhood, but it wasn't my main concern, but it was obviously a subliminal concern. But it was the main thing, it was the main story for some people because of their own experience. And I kind of think the director and the actor and the crew are that 25%. They're finishing off the stage play for you in a way.
Yeah.
And we had this interesting, one of those questions, how old is Harry?
Yeah.
And I don't know how old Harry is. It didn't matter that much when I wrote the novel for me to pinpoint when he was born, because every single person who read it, and I bet there's not a single person in this room who's read the book who ever wondered, I want to know when Harry was born. Because they would have just created his age in their head. They would have had a picture of him and said, oh, he's 40s at the beginning, you know, whatever. But it was important for the actor, because the actor needed to embody him. And so that was such an interesting little difference between what I'm doing and what you're doing.
Yeah, and what you say about the readers is also something that I feel kind of really strongly about stage plays, is actually it's not completed until you've got an audience there. And it's not so much the idea that you'll change things necessarily in order to accommodate an audience's response, but somehow there is this sort of, although you can, I mean, the whole tradition of out-of-town tryouts in America is based on that, really, that you fine-tune it with response to the audience reaction, and you do. But it's that there's some sort of magical alchemy that happens when the audience is there in the room with the actors, because it's never going to happen again. That night, that person is in the auditorium listening to the way that show is made, that time, it's never going to happen again. So it's an alchemy. It's an ongoing alchemy, and it's one of the addictions of the stage.
The obsession, I think, was the word you used earlier, Verity.
Both.
Addiction and obsession. We're getting a good insight into your life here, which is great. But really, there is such interrogation required for different forms. You know, there's a level of interrogation that's required to write the novel, and then the play, and then for those actors who are stepping out on stage and embodying those characters. And even in the detail of things like, you know, a beautiful workshop, how they're building the set or how they're making the props, and needing to know every little piece of tiny little detail to make sure that those props are exactly as they need to be, or exactly as they would be in, you know, 1888 or whatever the case is. So there's a lot of detail that goes into it all in various stages.
And actually, that's really interesting, because as a novelist, if I put all that detail into the book, you would not have enjoyed the book. And that's actually novel writing 101. Do the research and then just use one or two of the details so that you can locate the reader in time and place. But if you put every detail in that you've come across, you're just showing your research, and no one wants to read that. And because it's that 25% that the reader contributes is their understanding of history or place or whatever. But in theatre or film, it's incredibly different. You've got to get those details right, or you'll have people ringing in saying, that was very anachronistic. Yeah, no, that didn't happen.
Yes, absolutely. Now we will go to audience questions in just a moment. I just have one more, because you were talking before about women coming to you and saying, you know, the strong theme there for me is motherhood. And something that we've been discovering in rehearsals, which of course is in the writing, is how much this story is actually about women's bodies. So we're in this intellectual world, we're talking about words, we're talking about books, but there's so much about the female body. Menstruation, sex, childbirth, and
Cunts.
yes, cunts. Yeah, are you ready for that, everybody? I'm sure you will be, because you've read the book. So there's a lot of that in there, and I guess my question was, how important was it for you when you wrote the story to embody the physical world, the physical world as well as the intellectual world, or to write about both alongside one another, and how conscious
Well, I became conscious of it. So literally, the presentation earlier about the library was wonderful. So a lot of what I wrote came out of reading the dictionaries in the reading room at the State Library. So I started doing it in the Simon Library at the top of the turret across the road, and it's manned by volunteers, peopled by volunteers who were only there sporadically, and it just didn't work for me, so they did bring every volume down to the reading room so I could look at them whenever I wanted to. And essentially I would look up a word. So for instance, my research was always dictated by the story and by character. So when Esme gets her period, I thought, right, Esme, because she hasn't got a mother, in some ways the scriptorium acts for her a little bit like it provides her with the wisdom that a mother might occasionally. And she searches for understanding of her situation in the words. And in the pigeonholes. And so I thought, right, what would she be looking for? She would have asked her father what this is called. He would have come up with some technical medical term. She would have looked it up in the pigeonholes. It would have led her to word after word after word. I did exactly that in the dictionary. They didn't use the word period back then. They didn't use the word menstruation back then. They used this other word called catamenia. I have never heard that. I don't know if there's doctors in the room that know what that means. But it was fascinating to follow the trail of words, and what I realised was how much the dictionary tried to avoid talking about women's bodies. And I looked up clitoris, of course. I felt like a 12-year-old. The first time I actually did, I looked up all the bad words to see if they were there. Anyway, I looked up clitoris, and the explanation, it was there, but the definition had nothing to do with humans. It was so technical and foreign that you would never have thought that this word had anything to do with a female human. And I realised, that lo and behold, Victorian men had a problem with female bodies.
No. Who would have thought that?
But yeah, and so it was unavoidable that this story that I was writing about words and what might be missing from the dictionary, not just the words but the meanings and how words were defined. It was unavoidable in the end I couldn't ignore women's bodies.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Well, we have a little bit of time now for some questions from our lovely audience. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Yes, please.
One of the other themes in the book which I just thought was mention of the suffragists and Muriel Matters. I'm just wondering how you came across Muriel and why you included her in the book.
So that was such an indulgence. So the question was, how did I come across Muriel Matters, and how did I come to include her in the story? So I knew about Muriel. I'm not from South Australia. I'm from Sydney, but I knew about Muriel Matters through various texts that I've read, and I was surprised how little other people knew about her. She was the first woman to speak in British Parliament ever. She did all sorts of things for the women's movement in the UK. when she went over to try and be an actress. And I'm really proud of South Australia's history around women's suffrage, as accidental as it might have been. But I'm very proud of that, and it was an indulgence because I kind of wanted everyone else to know about it. so I put Muriel Matters in there, but it worked. I mean, she is a darling I didn't have to kill. Often you do put things in novels because you find them interesting, but they just don't work for the story. But she worked for the story, and it was a huge pleasure to be able to leave her in. And now more people know about Muriel Matters and South Australia's, leading the world in women's suffrage. And unfortunately, and also I should say, I say this every time, and I think at the moment it's relevant. South Australia was also gave Aboriginal men and women the vote in 1884, and they had the vote until 1901 when we became a federation, and we forget this. That was a right.
They never lost the vote in South Australia. They just didn't get it.
Yeah, they didn't. Yeah, but they lost some of the. So one of the things at Federation was that no one would lose any rights, but women's suffragists did not stand up for their Aboriginal brothers and sisters to ensure that they had the right to vote at a national level, and history tells the rest of that story.
Yeah, great, lovely. Thank you. That was a great question. Any other questions? Yes.
I just want to know, is Verity now going to write the Bookbinders of Jericho?
Verity, are you writing the Bookbinders of Jericho?
I'm not. That's got its own beautiful trajectory, I'm sure. What a good book, but.
The Dictionary of Lost Words, I believe, is having another life after the stage play. Is that right? Is that something that we know about or not?
Yeah, so it's been optioned for a limited series.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if people were aware of that yet or not, but congratulations. As I started saying that sentence, I thought, am I not supposed to be saying this? I thought, oh no, is this not out of the bag yet? Okay,
well, it hasn't. It hasn't started.
Sure.
So anything can happen, but it's another wonderful South Australian story because the producers are both South Australian, the people who've optioned it. So it's just been absolutely wonderful that so many wonderful South Australian creatives have picked it up. I feel really honoured.
Oh, it's incredible. It's a wonderful success. Yes?
It's a kind of strange, practical kind of question. So when you've got actors, and it's probably a question for you as well as everybody else, when actors are embarking on doing a play like this, which is from a novel, are you kind of asking them to read the novel, or does it matter, or kind of how's that working in the rehearsal room?
It's a great question.
And because of Pip's coming into rehearsals as well, are you kind of opening her up to their questions as well, even though Verity's written the play script from the novel?
Yeah. Great. So just to cover that question, if you didn't hear at the back, it was really in regards to how the actors then come on board and take that material. Are we asking them to read the book? Will they be asking questions of Pip, for example, or Verity? Great question. So we're very lucky because the cast that we have are all very intelligent actors. So they want to read as much as they possibly can. They absolutely have read the book, if not several times. Chris Pittman, who's playing Sir James Murray, I should say Sir. Sir James Murray has done such an incredible amount of research, and he was educating us all on day one, which was fantastic. So we have a cast with a really great appetite for research because they want to do this show, this play, this script. They want to do it justice as well. And so it has been absolutely wonderful to have Verity in the room so that we can ask questions of yourself and have an open discussion with the actors about the characters. And tomorrow, I'm not sure exactly what tomorrow will look like. I mean, we'll have some things to show you. I imagine some people will have some questions for you as well. So we'll see what that looks like. But yeah, they're very engaged with the material, which is fantastic. Yeah. Great. Any further questions before we finish up? Yeah, the final one down here.
Verity, you may have already said this, I can't quite remember, but had you actually read the book before the project was given to you?
Yes, I had. I had.
And
that...
did it, sorry to interrupt, did it actually speak to you as if to say, gosh, this would make a great play?
I had read it before, and it had been a convoluted series of synchronicities whereby I had actually read it. It had been advised to me as a terrific book by somebody I trusted. I then had to buy a present for a sick friend, and I hadn't read the books. Well, I was in a bookshop, grabbed that, gave it to her. She adored it. It really helped her. So after that, I thought I'd better read it. So I did read it, and I also listened to it because I have a long drive. I didn't actually think straight away this would make a great play because I was just reading it as a book. And I have done a number of adaptations over my career, but one's a children's novel, one was a picture book. I haven't adapted, a large contemporary novel. So that wasn't my instant go-to. Nowadays, since I've had this project, when I read a novel, I think,
And fair enough. And I imagine, Pip, when you were writing, you didn't foresee that it would be a production.
No, because, and we talked about this, one of the difficulties I think for Verity is that Esme is a very internal person. So she's not very performative, so that's another challenge in terms of turning this into a stage play. But no, that wasn't ever in my mind.
There you go. There's the brilliance of our artistic director, Mitchell Butel, for figuring out that this is going to be great on the stage. So well done to Mitchell. Fantastic. Look, we have reached our time now. So can we thank very much Pip and Verity.